If you think life is hard now, then you might want to take a look at what life was like for lower class citizens hundreds of years ago. Peasants were known as the poorest people on the land who were forced into some truly terrible jobs because everyone knew they would do pretty much anything for some quick cash. This was especially difficult for women who were trying to raise families in terrible conditions while also working some rather painful jobs. First and foremost though are the living conditions. The lower class citizens would usually live on the outskirts of town or in rural communities. Their homes would usually be constructed from timber, bricks, and mud and lacked any basic household amenities like plumbing. They would also be sleeping on the floor or on top of rock-hard beds that would never provide a good night's sleep. Now, because peasants had little to no money, they would usually be forced to live in the bad parts of town that did not have access to clean drinking water or fresh food. This meant they basically had to take whatever they could get, but this unfortunately led to many complications. Because they would often be drinking dirty water, eating spoiled foods, they would be very prone to contracting some terrible diseases. Everything from dysentery to the Black Plague was hanging around peasant communities, and it was nearly impossible to treat these infections. The world of medicine was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, so contracting any of these illnesses would usually end in a terrible fate. The only way that peasants were really able to take advantage of these scary diseases was through a job known as leech collecting. This is pretty self-explanatory, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Leeches were a common form of treatment for many diseases thanks to their blood-sucking tendencies. Doctors would use these leeches to try and extract the diseases out of a patient's body, and they needed someone to go and collect these leeches for them. Peasants would often head into dirty water to go looking for these nasty creatures so they could scoop them up and sell them back to the doctors. Even if the pay was better than other jobs, the risk factor was often very high. Peasants would have to walk into the same dirty water they were drinking from, and the leeches would often pass along other diseases that they were carrying. Now, while some peasants had to take on dirty jobs in their own communities, others could find employment through royals and nobles. It might sound better than the alternative, but peasants were often forced into harsh physical labor, which included terrible working conditions. These lower class citizens were pretty much used as slaves, and they would have to do anything their masters ordered them to do. This could involve anything from construction to field work, and either option would be incredibly difficult. Peasants often worked from sunrise to sunset with little to no breaks. They could be working in the boiling heat without food or water, and this would often lead to starvation and dehydration. Now, unfortunately, they didn't really have a choice because they need to provide for their families, but these conditions were far from ideal. They did, however, play an integral role in ensuring that food supply would stay on track and societies wouldn't crumble. Although the upper class citizens really didn't think too highly of them, society would have ultimately collapsed if it weren't for the peasants doing all of the dirty work. There were some royals who actually treated their peasants with some respect and dignity, but this wasn't always the case. Most of the time it was very hard work for very little pay. Nobles could dispose of their peasants whenever they felt like it if they weren't satisfied with their work. Now, even with their low-paying jobs and their terrible living conditions, peasants were still forced to pay their fair share of taxes. We all know the old saying of the two guarantees in life, and this was no different in the Dark Ages, even for the poor citizens. Peasants had to pay rent directly to the lords they were working for, so a good portion of the money they were receiving went straight back into the pockets of their own employers. On top of their high rent, they would also have to pay a tax to the local church that was known as tithe. This was usually 10% of whatever they made in the previous year, and peasants had two ways they could pay this. If they had enough money remaining after all of their other expenses were taken care of, they could pay the 10% tithe in cash. If they did not have enough money to pay their taxes, however, they would have to give up some of their basic necessities. This would include things like seeds and wheat or building equipment that was essential to everyday living. If the peasants gave up a good portion of their inventory to pay off the tithe charges, it would make it incredibly hard for them to survive. This was especially a problem in the winter months when the temperatures would drop below freezing. Some peasants would have to give up their wood that was used to heat their homes. This would make it incredibly hard to survive the cold winter months. And if you thought their problem stopped at poor living conditions, terrible jobs, and lack of food, then you'll be very wrong. The justice system in the Dark Ages was also very hard on peasants. Lower class citizens would often have to turn to petty crimes such as theft when the going got really tough. If they were unable to come up with money on their own, they would sometimes have to steal it from others just to survive. Some of them would also steal food from markets just to feed themselves and their families. Now, while stealing is never acceptable, it seems like the justice system was extra harsh on these lower class citizens. It was quite obvious that they just didn't care about peasants and felt that they really didn't need to be a part of their society. While upper class citizens could afford to bribe their way out of far worse crimes, peasants would often be charged through the nose. Now, obviously most of them couldn't afford these charges, so they would often be tossed in jail or be subjected to a trial by ordeal. This was a pretty twisted way to decide if a person was innocent or guilty. It was basically designed to set the peasant up for failure. A person on trial would usually have to walk across burning coals or hold onto a steaming hot iron. If the burn would heal within a few days, then you were deemed innocent. but if they didn't, you were guilty. It would obviously take much longer than a few days for severe burns to heal, so it's quite clear the justice system was designed to punish the lower class citizens no matter what. The only way to really avoid these harsh punishments was to try and earn your money and food legitimately, or join a special quasi-police force. Because there was no organized police service in the Dark Ages, most regions required the general public to handle the criminals in their villages. In many regions, males over the age of 12 were almost forced to join these special police forces to ensure that things didn't get out of hand in their own communities. If they did manage to spot any crimes taking place, they would either pursue the criminals themselves or call upon their fellow citizens to do the work for them. While it was an important job to ensure that order remained in place, it also meant that wives and younger females were left to fend for themselves back home. This provided yet another challenge for peasant women, as they would often have to do a lot of the grunt work back home, while the males were forced to chase after criminals. It's also one of the many reasons why many women had to get jobs working in the fields. The makeshift police force rarely ever brought in any legitimate money and was seen as more of a mandatory volunteer service. So to sum things up, nothing was ever easy for peasants in the Dark Ages. Between harsh living conditions and terrible jobs, it was nearly impossible for these lower class citizens to climb their way out of the bottom and succeed in life. While they undoubtedly worked as hard as they could to survive, looks like the system was always working against them. So we hope you enjoyed this insight into the life of peasants during the Dark Ages, and we'll see you all next time. If you think life is hard now, then you might want to take a look at what life was like for lower class citizens hundreds of years ago. Peasants were known as the poorest people on the land who were forced into some truly terrible jobs because everyone knew they would do pretty much anything for some quick cash. This was especially difficult for women who were trying to raise families in terrible conditions while also working some rather painful jobs.